Okay, everybody, here we are, Kinesiology 231. This is video number 3 regarding flexibility. And the book goes into a couple of different subcategories and how these influence flexibility. So let's take a look at just one concept that we have to look at and kind of evaluate, and it's pointed out in the book. They talk about hyperlaxicity, and you look at somebody who is diagnosed at birth having this condition. You know, these are individuals who have a hyperlaxicity within the joint itself, and you have to be cautious in terms of how much flexibility work you do with them, because they have the ability to already be very, very bendy, very flexible, just because of their predisposition. But there's a difference between that condition and being hypermobile. Now, almost all sports, to a certain degree, when you compare them to a norm population, require a high degree of hypermobility. That's not to say that the person might not have some hyperlaxicity in their joints, but they have to have some hypermobility. Just think in terms of this young lady doing the balance beam. She has to be hypermobile in her back, has to be hypermobile in her shoulders. Also incredibly strong and incredibly powerful, but there's a hypermobility component that has to happen for her to do this movement pattern. Same thing with wrestling, very dynamic, a lot of different movement patterns, and as a result, you have to have very, very high degree of mobility to actually to move on a mat. Same thing with javelin throwers. If you ever watch training videos for javelin throwers, my goodness, and you look at this and go, okay, these people are definitely hypermobile, but that's going to be different than hyperlaxicity. Two different animals, all right? So when you get to work with your people and you're working with athletes, you may have to work on hypermobility to do some activities, but if a person comes in and they've been diagnosed with a condition called hyperlaxicity, that's going to be different. You have to use a little bit of caution when you work with those people. All right, so flexibility itself, it's definitely a perishable process, a perishable skill. I always describe it as when I work with older clients, and it's something you have to work on. Getting back to the functional range of motion that we talked about before, as people sit, they age, they lose their ability to work through a functional range of motion. They lose the ability to gain strength. So you can kind of see how these two are undeniably tied to one another, flexibility and strength. And also flexibility begets mobility, which begets proprioception. And so when you have an older population, you're talking about trip and slips, falls, it becomes kind of this combination of strength, mobility, and proprioception. So you have to work with individuals in this domain. You have to. And you have to do it, especially as people get older, but you have to do it in terms of being able to apply the right stimulus to get the response you want. So you can't necessarily fold your person up like a pretzel at first, but you can definitely work them towards that process. And say like an elderly person trying to do a down dog might be contraindicated just because they can't get there because of blood pressure concerns or overall orthopedic concerns. So there's a little bit of a trade-off you have to have in there where you have to be able to evaluate what your client can or can't do. I digress. So when you look at training programs as people get older, you have to incorporate in some flexibility. So let's take a look at this, progesterone and also estrogen. These two play off of each other and vacillate during pregnancy. And when you look at the role that you have between these two, it certainly is something that's not static and it undulates. And what you have is you have this response in the body, and the response itself is cyclical in nature based off of the menstrual cycle that's seen in females. And it causes this elasticity process where it reflects, if you will, if you look, and I'll bring up a study here in a second, I'm trying to encapsulate it well and I'm not doing a good job. But what really you have is a relationship between progesterone and estrogen and how it affects the actual tendinous and ligaments, tendon materials and ligament materials, to cause somebody to become more hyperlax, if you will. So now getting back to our hypermobile versus hyperlax conversation, you can imagine you have a female athlete who's running down the soccer field or the basketball court, and perhaps she's somewhere in her cycle, and as a result of this transition from progesterone to estrogen, it's caused laxicity in the joint while she's also working in an environment that requires her to be very hypermobile, one can kind of see and understand how ACL injuries can happen or other injuries can happen to tendons and ligaments. And there are a number of studies to help support this. The book references one of them in terms of, it looks like Elling and colleagues. I have one over here by Slaughterback in 2002, and it's the relationship of progesterone and estrogen during different segments of the menstrual cycle. And it's actually a really good informative article on something where if you're working with athletes in that population, you kind of have to be cognizant of training load so you don't blow your people out of the water and perhaps blow an ACL out on somebody. So let's take a look at temperature. With temperature itself, this is pretty straightforward, and I think it's something you can all understand, that the warm-up is a crucial part of the process. It allows the muscles themselves to become more pliable, and an overall generalized warm-up works to our advantage, whether it's through having a warmer external temperature to the body, or the person is actually moving and that generalized warm-up is causing an increase internally. Either way, warming up before a flexibility program is key. And you can look at this in terms of the warm-up and flexibility can be almost a combination where one is an extension of the other. I tend to do just kind of a generalized warm-up with my athletes where we'll do running technique warm-up, where we start with very low-level A skips and work our way up to more aggressive skipping protocols as part of their warm-up towards doing speed, agility, and quickness drills, and we'll see this later on. Now, if we go ahead and take a look at temperature a smidge further, one of the articles that I pulled up here is this, and it highlights how you have muscle temperature and core temperature. That's what T to M, and you have core to T, excuse me, and M to T is here. You have muscle temperature and core temperature. You have all these different benefits, and I just listed a few of them out here for you, but this is the article if you want to go source this. And it's pretty good. They do a good job over here of talking more in terms of how it has a positive effect to performance. All right, so with activity level, and I think you can pretty much figure this one out, right? If a person's been more active, they've been moving through range of motions, particular ranges of motion, and as a result, they're going to be more mobile, and their flexibility will increase. So when you take somebody who has not been active, who sits at their job, etc., they are probably not going to be as mobile as someone who plays pickleball 3 times a week. It just makes sense. And the other part of that is there are people who actually do stuff and work out. If you think of one slide back in terms of warm-up, they've learned how to actually warm up the body and make the muscle tissue more pliable. So you have this kind of global effect of where their body has become better at warming itself up, and then they're prepared for movement, and then they can actually do their movement better, whether it's flexibility, playing pickleball, or lifting weights. So I would contest that this is a pretty key indicator in terms of your person's ability to be able to function, not only just in terms of working out, but also their flexibility. All right, so let's get back to this. You remember the functional range of motion, less strength capacity. Let's talk about resistance training. And it really, when you look at it just at face value, it just kind of makes sense. And if we look at a bicep curl, right, you have this participant over here who's doing a bicep curl. And when they do the bicep curl, they're going through flexion and extension. And to make flexion happen, they shorten the bicep. But what has to happen to the antagonistic muscle group? First, I'll give you a moment to think about what the antagonistic muscle group is. You should be saying tricep. So when the agonist is contracting, the elbow is the elbow joint is closing, and so you have a concentric movement pattern. Well, you have on the back side, the tricep has to elongate. Now, granted, you have reciprocal inhibition, which shuts off an impulse to that muscle, so it doesn't co-contract with the biceps. But as this is contracting and shortening, this is elongating passively because the bicep is making it happen. And what happens is, if we go ahead and switch that up to a tricep pushdown, we have this tricep pushdown. It's the same thing. You're going through flexion and extension, but because of the loading parameters and where the resistance is coming from, well defined by this cable here, The tricep is shortening as the hands are being pushed down, going, and the elbows going into extension, and the bicep is elongating. So if you have a limited range of motion on one side of that equation as the antagonist, then you know you're going to limit the range of motion on the agonist side. So there's an absolute relationship between those two, where you have to have the flexibility on one side to allow the mobility on the other side and the contractibility on the other side. So when you look at a golf swing now and you look at the segmentation of a golf swing, which is very dynamic, you look at that and go, okay, anywhere in that movement pattern, level to level to level across the vertebrae, up in the shoulders, across the torso, anywhere in that whole series of the kinetic chain itself, if there's a limiting factor, it can limit you in terms of strength on one side or the mobility to get through a full range of motion, to have a full functional range of motion to allow for a full contractile response, meaning more potential energy to swing your golf club. All right, let's look at elasticity and plasticity real quick. The book throws these at us here, and when you look at this, you look at the difference between those, and the big takeaway with these two is with plasticity, you have this stretch, and then after the stretch, you still have a greater range of motion after the load is moved. With elasticity, you have the muscle is stretched and it goes back to its resting length after a stretch. So one is temporary elasticity. Plasticity is a permanent, if you will, lengthening of the muscle. So perhaps you remember this by going plasticity, permanent, PP, and elasticity is the other one. That's how I would do it if I was in grad school. So that's where I'm going to end this video and move on to the next one. All right, guys, thank you so much.